there's a lot happening in the news at the moment. There's things going on in Ethiopia with Tigrayan rebels capturing the regional capital. The king of Eswatini has fled. There's a Euro round of 16 game going on right now between England and Germany. And according to Africa as a Country's algorithm, which is based on how many African diaspora players each team has, you should be rooting for England. So there's lots going on, but very big news coming out of South Africa today is that the Constitutional Court, which is the apex court of the country, has found former President Jacob Zuma guilty of contempt of court. And they've sentenced him to a 15-month unsuspended sentence. And he has until the weekend to present himself to the South African Police Service, which is like, massive news in South Africa. And we just thought it would be good to get someone to help us unpack exactly what this all means. And we're very thrilled to have on the show Dan Mafora, who is a contributor to Africa as a Country. He also works as a researcher for the Council of the Advancement of the South African Constitution. He runs his own Substack blog. He is a co-host of the podcast Just Us Under the Tree. So Dan is a very prolific man. So we're very excited to have him on the show. And for all of you who don't know, Dan wrote an article for us a few months ago and it was called The Strong Man's Vision of Democracy. And so Dan, maybe a question to start. Is the strong man still strong or is he now a little bit weak? What do you think this means for Zuma?
That's a very good question. We'll see after this weekend whether or not he's still strong. But if anything, today's judgment was a huge blow because I don't think a lot of us, I don't know what we were expecting, but we didn't expect the court to be as strong or to come out as strong as it did. So certainly not today, not as strong today.
So just give a bit of brief background for our viewers. What led up to this finding of contempt was his refusal to testify at the Zondo Commission into state capture. He was supposed to testify. He didn't want to do that. And why was he so resistant to appearing at this commission?
Yeah, so there's two things here. One is that this is about his defiance of a court order, right? So in the first instance, I think in December last year, the commission went to court because he had refused to comply with summons that it had issued. So they went to court to get an order compelling him to come to testify. And then they got that order in January of this year. And he then, the order itself set a time frame for him to comply with it. A fresh round of summons was issued, and then he failed to comply with that. So the commission now went back and said, look, this guy's in contempt, and we're not seeking an order that would, compel him to come testify. We want a sentence of imprisonment, which is something very unusual, at least for it to come directly to the court, right? So you find contempt applications in lower courts and the high court and stuff. So this was the first time I think the court had to deal with a direct application for an order of contempt. And yeah, they got it today, and the court sentenced him to 15 months in jail, prison, unsuspended.
And it's interesting, you mentioned that this is something that is unusual for courts of this level to do. A lot of what explains just how, let's say, I guess, punitive the court was in its finding is that this case was not only about this isolated finding by Zuma, but sort of relates to this long-standing effort he's initiated to try and test just how robust South Africa's judiciary is. He's, as you wrote so eloquently in that article, he's gone to great lengths to question the legitimacy of the judiciary. And so this was as much a fight for the integrity of the judiciary as it was coming to the right conclusion about what should happen following his defiance of this summons.
Yeah, so I definitely think it was a rebuke of the kind of attacks that he has leveled on the court and, well, the judiciary in general. Because when you read the judgment, the court says, look, he didn't even bother to come and defend himself, right? He didn't even bother to come and explain why he didn't comply with the order. But what he did do was make public statements, issue, write letters and attack people, impugn people's reputations and conduct as unlawful, unconstitutional, as vindictive and stuff. And the court said, all of this is damaging to the courts because you erode public trust in our ability to do what the Constitution requires, which is to, administer justice. And for that reason, and for the reason that you have continuously failed to account for the things that you have done, we find you guilty of contempt. And the only way that and the court says quite blatantly that they're making an example out of him, and in that way vindicate their position in a way that I think is a great show of strength, at least by the highest court in the land. Yeah.
And what does one say to some people who might be worried that, on the one hand, there is this need for the court to make an example of Zuma to sort of show a clear stand that intimidation, attacks, and threats to the judiciary aren't going to be tolerated, but at the same time, in doing so, somewhat overstepping the function of a court and politicizing the function of a court? Do you think that's something that people could say legitimately, or at this point, was it necessary?
I mean, I don't think it's something that people can say legitimately. When you look at Zuma's history in the courts, it has evolved, right? So from the time when he was first charged with corruption, and then those charges were dropped, and then the fight about the dropping of those charges, his strategy has evolved every single time. But now that he, is out of political capital, is out in the cold, he has effectively said that he is going to operate outside of the system, right? So his strategy is to attack judges, to attack the courts, and say that they are part of a political conspiracy, blah 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 blah, without any kind of basis, factual or otherwise, for doing so. And so the court even says that, look, we have tried so hard to get Mr. Zuma to come to court to explain to us why he has done what he has done. And they even went to the extent of inviting him to say, if we find you guilty of contempt, what would the appropriate sanction be, right? He didn't even bother to do that. So they say, we can't be accused of not being fair when we have deliberately gone out of our way to say, please come and talk to us, and let us know how to deal with it. I think that, of course, there's politics around this, and that's going to play itself out, and it's going to influence how this decision is seen or received. But ultimately, it is a question of law, and it is a question that he chose not to answer. It's a process that he chose not to participate in. So at the end of the day, that is a risk that he took. And of course, there's lots of other things that we can talk about the judgment itself. But what is clear is that it can't be impugned on the basis that, it's some sort of orchestrated political campaign against him.
And in terms of his claim that this is an orchestrated political campaign, Zuma exemplifies a political tendency in South Africa that is growing increasingly frustrated with the judiciary. They're associated with factions of the ruling party, the African National Congress, which is deeply embedded in networks of patronage, corruption, and so on. And so, although this is the boldest anyone has been in terms of testing the courts, this doesn't feel like it's going to be the end of politicians testing the courts. So what are the political implications of this? I mean, I'm seeing that there's protests in defense of Zuma being planned for tomorrow at the Constitutional Court. A lot of people are now looking at him as some kind of martyr for a good cause. Do you think do you think a lot of these players are going to be intent on acting on their sense of grievance and injury and defiance, or is it something that will go away?
Look, I think the biggest test is going to be for the ANC government, right? The court singles out the Minister of Police, the National Commissioner, and the station commander at Ngandla to say, if Mr. Zuma does not present himself to the police station after 5 days, you have to arrest him and get him to a correctional center. And so whether there's the political will to do that will be the biggest test. And it will also mean, or it will also expose whether or not the executive is actually committed to, implementing court orders, or whether it's just another platitude that they say. And so that's going to be the immediate challenge, which I think should give Ramaphosa, Bheki and the others a few sleepless nights in the days ahead. But I mean, it was always going to be a situation where he martyrs himself, right? He becomes the martyr to say, oh no, he's being persecuted, he's being unfairly treated, and that has always been the case, even in the presence of just like an exhaustive list of just like chances at court processes, at like getting off on charges, not answering, just evading any kind of accountability. But that's just the kind of charismatic leader that he is, that nothing that's empirical in any kind of way will be able to sway the views of his supporters. And so that for me isn't much of a challenge, because I mean, they could protest, they could have rallies and all these things. That's not going to change the judgment. But what is left now is for the implementation of the order and the consequences that flow from that. So at worst, what we're looking at is probably a decisive split in the ANC over how it's handled. But beyond that, I think any other apprehension about the strength of the court or the judiciary as a whole it would be overstated at this point.
Last question: do you think Zuma is going to hand himself over at the weekend, or is he going to?
Yeah, this weekend is going to be very interesting. What I don't think he will, but he has said he would rather go to jail than cooperate with the State Capture Commission. He's got his wish now. I don't expect him to live up to his word, but you never know. It might actually just make him more of a martyr if he, just pitches up and says, I'm here to accept my punishment and I'm ready to start serving my sentence. But I do think there will be a bit of tension this weekend. Of course, you've heard about the MK veterans setting up perimeters around his property and stuff like that. And so if an order is given that there is an existing order for his arrest after the 5 days, but I think there might be a bit of a kerfuffle, let's say, between those people and the police. Yeah.
Well, Dan, we look forward to your live tweeting of what goes down over the weekend. We know you'll have some spicy takes and funny observations.